Welcome to the MamasteFit Podcast. In this week's episode, we'll be discussing how to process your birth story if maybe it wasn't what you expected. Welcome to the MamasteFit Podcast. This is Gina, perinatal fitness trainer and birth doula.
And this is Roxanne, labor and delivery nurse and student midwife.
And this is the MamasteFit Podcast, where we empower you on your prenatal fitness, birth, and postpartum return to fitness journey.
Our podcast shares how to move throughout your pregnancy to stay strong and comfortable. Pain is not a requirement of pregnancy. Understand the science of birth and how to approach recovery after birth.
We share our personal experiences as mothers navigating the stage of lives, plus our professional expertise as birth workers and fitness professionals.
Our goal is to help you feel confident as you navigate the perinatal timeframe for an empowering pregnancy, positive birth, and postpartum journey.
We are glad to have you with us on this journey and that you've chosen us to support you.
We have the privilege of having Dr. Alyssa Berlin with us, a perinatal psychologist based out of Los Angeles, California. Thanks for being here with us today, Dr. Berlin.
Gina and Roxanne, thank you for having me. Thank you for doing this podcast and really showcasing such an important idea and experience, because I think one of the biggest problems that we deal with in the world of mental health as a whole, and definitely around birth and pregnancy and parenting, is that we're afraid to talk. And a lot of us, kind of live in silence out of fear how people will perceive us or, bigger consequences that a lot of this goes unspoken. And so sharing your birth stories and really, again, showcasing this topic and making it okay, giving women permission is tremendous. So really, ladies, thank you for doing that.
So I actually did my own postpartum therapy with Dr. Berlin after the birth of my son when I was dealing with a lot of postpartum OCD and anxiety. I had had 2 pregnancy losses before his pregnancy and then just felt so anxious throughout his pregnancy that kind of continued into the postpartum period for me. So I kind of reached a point where I realized what I was feeling was not normal. And so I reached out to Dr. Berlin and she helped me a ton with processing this and continues to be an amazing resource for us to this day. And so my first birth story was definitely a more traumatic experience that was really the result of being treated pretty poorly in the later part of my pregnancy and during my birth. And I share my first birth story in episode 2 of our podcast if you want to go back and listen to it. I ultimately had a birth that I was not expecting or preparing for, and my biggest issue was that I was trying to sort through this disappointing experience and mourning the birth that I had been preparing for, while also being really excited that my baby was here. And so I was scared that if I was disappointed in her birth, that it meant that our story started off with trauma. And so I told myself that it was fine, that my birth was fine. And I was almost looking at my second birth as my redemption shot of what I wanted the first time around. And so it took me years to really come to terms with her birth and finally accept that it was not a positive experience and that it was okay for me to accept that it was not a positive experience, but it didn't mean that the way I was treated was okay. And so understanding that I could accept the experience and acknowledge that what had happened was not okay. And so Dr. Berlin specializes in perinatal mental health and was a great resource to me, and I'm really excited to have her here to talk about how we can process our birth, because this is a common question that we get from a lot of our followers. Like for a lot of my doula clients, where it's their subsequent pregnancies, they're reaching out and they're like, hey, I want to do all the right things this time because my previous birth was not what I was preparing for. It was not what I was expecting. And it always breaks my heart because I know what they're feeling.
So our first question for you would be, how would you recommend that somebody begin to process their birth story? Whether it was traumatic or if it was just something that they didn't expect, or even if they just have negative experiences or emotions around their birth.
I want us to talk about first and foremost that when we talk about birth trauma, birth trauma is one of those things where it's in the eyes of the beholder. So people who have attended our births may be like, wow, that was beautiful. And we may not feel that way. By the way, one of the fastest ways to kind of shut up a woman who had a negative experience is having someone else be like, that was great, before really being able to even check in with that mom and be like, how are you doing? Right? How are you feeling? And so we can even start right then and there, instead of imposing or assuming what a mom's experience was, slowing down and asking and checking in and giving permission for the whole range of emotions and experiences around something. I think that's already, kind of putting us down a certain path where we pick up these subliminal messages of what is and isn't okay. So that's, I think, a really important starting point. Another thing that I think really worth mentioning, and talking about as we talk about what it is to be able to create that space to process a birth story is that society really does us a tremendous disservice, where I think there's a lot of times that assumption that the ends justify the means. And Gina, you kind of, we're talking a little bit about that in terms of like being in these two places. Like, I'm so happy she's here and I'm so happy she's healthy. But, what was that experience? And is it okay to even be like, gosh, it's not what I wanted and I don't like the way I was treated, right? But how often I'll hear women in my practice say like, oh, but I know that I should just be focused and be grateful that, a healthy baby is here. Or I should just be, grateful that, it went a certain way. And again, a lot of imposed energy and expectation that will very quickly, quiet down a mom who maybe is wanting to share something else. So one of the first things that we want to do is to really empower women and to empower families, right? We're focusing more on the mom, but we know that birth trauma is something that could happen to mom as well as the non-birthing partner and really anyone in that space. It's not uncommon that I'll have women reach out to me and say, hey, can you see my partner? I'm okay, or I didn't really know what was going on, so I'm not as impacted, but he's really struggling or she's really struggling with what that experience was like. So again, birth trauma can really impact anyone in that space. And step one is, again, creating that permission to really speak up, that there's no expectation of how you're supposed to feel. And whatever it is you have to say, we're happy to listen. And so really empowering women to be able to talk and to share. And that's the first step. How are you ladies doing? How are you guys feeling as we start to talk down this path? No doubt reflecting on some of those imposed messages that you each experienced as you were going through these moments.
Thankfully, I've had you to work with over the years to mentally and emotionally move past the experience. And I'm in a space now where talking about the harder aspects of my birth doesn't trigger me or bring me back to that place anymore. So thank you for supporting me in that. Something that we have a lot of folks ask us, and it was something that I struggled with as well, was how can we let go of the guilt or the blame that we put on ourselves for our birth experience? So I'm definitely in a place now where I truly believe that I did not deserve to be treated like that and that I did not do something to deserve that experience. And I have come to understand that I did the best I could with the knowledge that I had, and I prepared as best as I could. There were things that were just outside of my control, and it wasn't anything that I necessarily did that caused that experience. And I could totally go back and be like, hindsight 2020, and be like, oh, I could have done this differently and this differently, and then maybe that wouldn't have happened. But at the end of the day, the provider that I had was just not having a good day, and the way that they treated me was what really caused a lot of the trauma. And so how could you recommend that someone could let go of the guilt and the blame that they're forcing onto themselves?
And it's so hard. And, even as you were talking initially, right, about the idea that women come to you for a second or third or a subsequent birth and like, we want our redemption birth, which I always bristle at that word because no woman is likely in need of redemption in that she didn't do anything wrong. Now, that's not to say we don't want a very different birth experience, right? But the reason that women come in with that energy of I want to do it different or I want a different experience, right, is just astounding to me. It's like there are very few places, if you will, where we go from novice to expert, more than in this field where we experience something. And this is true postpartum also, right? It's like being, the parent of baby number one and then the parent baby number two. It's like, man, oh man, right? It's night and day of what we know. And so I think that that's a lot of that experience here. Also, when we go through a traumatic experience, first and foremost, we tend to do a lot of soul searching and research. And, it really does inform then where things could have been different. I'll throw out this and then I'm going to get back to your question. The idea that a lot of times when I work with women, it's reframing. It's not that mom failed, which is oftentimes the experience that somehow either they or their body failed to do what they thought or wanted or should have done, air quotes, right? But oftentimes I'll reframe it to, you know what? Your team failed you. Your birth team failed you. You didn't fail. You did the best you could with what you had, or but your birth team failed you and failed to either treat you, right, like in your case, Gina, or to support you in the ways that you really want. And so, as we even kind of go into picking our practitioners, I'm often really outspoken of like, you don't want a doctor that's going to tolerate you. You want a doctor that's really invested in what you're wanting, right? So it's not just like, yeah, sure, and we'll see. But it's like, no, like they're really in line with you. And philosophically, we're wanting the same thing. Guilt is such a hard thing because I'm pretty sure that us moms, more than dads, but us moms get in line about 6 times over when they're handing out guilt. We ride and come to that maternal guilt so deeply because if ever there's a role that we really want to get right, it's being a mom. And that starts in that birthing process. And a lot of us go into it with, expectations of what we want it to be and how we want it to go and really wanting to foster a certain experience. So, I kind of want to come at this question from two different perspectives, which is things that we can do to kind of prevent the potential of trauma, and that's not always possible, and we know that. There's a lot, and again, the two doulas sitting in front of me, you guys can tell me better than I can, right, about all the different things that we can't possibly anticipate or prepare for, right? And I'm sure you get a lot of women who are like, okay, so here's how it's going to go, and you're like, wait a second. But having more accurate expectations going in, that ability to be flexible and to go through, to an openness to what might be, can be really helpful, first of all, on that prevention side. Something else that we find that can be really helpful in the potential, right, potential prevention is really slowing things down. So it's not always possible, but when it is, and things are changing for a woman in that birth experience or things are deviating from what they want, but slowing down and really talking to mom and talking to the non-birthing partner and either giving them that chance to ask questions, giving them that chance to understand, giving them that chance to perhaps wrap their mind around what it is that their practitioner is wanting to do can really be a tremendous buffer in experiencing trauma. And I remember, I moonlighted as a doula for a very short period of time. And, our family learned that having two on-call parents was not a good idea. So I was very happy to give the mantle to my husband. But I remember being a doula at a birth, where things all of a sudden just took a turn, right? And all of a sudden couldn't get baby on the monitor. And the room was stormed by people. And they're manipulating mom this way and that way. And mom is freaking out. And I just, slowed down and I went to mom and I'm like, how are you feeling? What's going on? And every question she would ask or have, I would broadcast it to the room and then repeat it back to her quietly and just giving her that information of what's going on, why it's happening. Hey, I know it feels really scary, but actually in this situation, it was a good thing, right? Baby had sunk into the canal so deeply that's why the monitors were struggling. And actually you're getting closer to birth. Like, it's okay. She'll still talk about, after the fact of like, oh my gosh, what I would have been left with if I didn't have that person to slow down and talk to me so I could make sense and process and be, feel comfortable and feel a part of it, right? Empower her to be a part of it. So those are just some of the things that we can do to kind of help either before or in the moment. What do we do after? And after is really hard. After, when, again, whether a birth didn't go the way we thought it would go or the way we wanted it to go, maybe there was an intervention or, again, an emergency that happened that left mom either feeling scared or disempowered or something. It does. It's really impactful. And I usually find a couple of different things. One thing that can be helpful is, like we said, people willing to listen without judgment, without quieting mom, but really willing to listen to the experience. Women, at the end of the day, we're verbal processors. And so I'll tell men all the time, right, in my preparation for birth class, I'm like, guess what? Your job is going to be to listen to your partner tell your birth story over and over again, like you didn't have front row seats to the experience and like you've never heard it before. Because if she's wanting to share it, guess what? You get to listen, right? And it's even priming the people around mom for what would be helpful and supportive. And maybe it is listening to her say it over and over and over again as she's trying to digest and make sense of it. Now, in deference to our non-birthing partners, you can suggest calling a mom, a friend. But I'm like, but if at the end of the day, you're the one she wants to talk to, buckle up and get ready to listen, because that can be really helpful. And having people, again, not try to minimize, but listen, right, can be very helpful and cathartic. Other things that can be helpful is talking to other women who have had traumatic births. Being able to share your story is very powerful. And having other people who are like, you know what, I get it, right? I hear you and I get it and I'm right there with you can also be really helpful. Things can be really difficult and impactful, right? They can have really impacted us deeply. And usually, again, talking to people around us will be helpful. When things hit that threshold of trauma, it often requires more professional help, because the concept of trauma is that things are kind of getting stuck. Talking about it has value, but somewhat limited value to really being able to address the trauma. And to me, guilt is a symptom of that trauma. And so, gratefully, there's some wonderful techniques out there that are super helpful in processing and digesting and releasing that trauma from the body. And so those would probably be some of the more beneficial ways to address that guilt. EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Francine Shapiro's approach can be very helpful. It's one of my main modalities when I'm working with trauma. And then Peter Levine's approach of somatic experiencing, or SE, is also really helpful because we are helping to digest the experience using the body. And at the end of the day, a lot of it is really stored in the body, right? A lot of times when people experience trauma, the ways that it'll manifest is either a lot of thoughts, but the more somatic ways are shortness of breath, sweating, a racing heart, a feeling of like electricity in the body and things like that. And so we just know that we are much more effective dealing with it from a bottom-up, somatic-oriented perspective than just talk. Talk is very helpful. And I definitely like women to be able to reframe and, to come at the experience from a different way, right? Like we were talking about even before, where it's not that, God forbid, a woman or her body failed, but, perhaps the team failed you, or you didn't have what you were expecting or wanting to have. What are you thinking? As I laid a whole lot at you.
Let's take a break from this week's episode to hear from one of our sponsors, Needed, a nutrition company focused on optimal nourishment for the perinatal journey. We need choline to support our baby's neural tube formation and cognitive development, as well as for our own health benefits. But many of us are not getting enough choline in our diets, and most prenatals include only a bare minimum amount or none at all. New research also suggests that we need double of the current recommendations. That's one of the reasons I love Needed so much. Needed's core products contain choline, plus they have a choline add-on. I highly recommend adding Needed's choline onto any prenatal vitamin you are taking. To get started, head to thisisneeded.com and use code MamastePod for 20% off your first order or first 3 months of a Needed subscription. So it was definitely really helpful for me after my birth and then after my 2 miscarriages to essentially just kind of repeat the story over and over again to other people as I was processing it. And especially with my miscarriages, it was so helpful because a lot of the people have had pregnancy losses, and so I felt so much less alone when I started sharing my story. And then some of my other friends were like, hey, I actually have had a pregnancy loss too, but I haven't told anyone about it. You're the first person that I have told it to. And so it became this very healing experience, like we were in it together kind of thing. I only found this out because I was telling other people my story. And so it became this really super helpful thing to do. And then to be able to repeat that same story multiple times was really helpful for me in my own healing process. And then, of course, being able to speak to a professional really helps